Thanksgiving is one of the most celebrated American holidays. I'm sure you're familiar. It's a day each year, the fourth Thursday in November actually, when we gather together with family and loved ones for a big meal and to give thanks. What are some of your favorite Thanksgiving foods? Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes? What about the pumpkin pie? That's my favorite. It's a holiday about gratitude. Gratitude means feeling thankful and appreciating all the good things you have in your life. You might be thankful for your family or friends, your teacher, your school. You might be thankful to have a place to live or food to eat. That's Thanksgiving. But there's another whole part to it too, a historical part. You're probably at least a little familiar with that story too, the story of the first Thanksgiving. This was a meal, a feast, that took place at the Plymouth Colony in 1621 between English colonists and Indigenous Americans. But here's the thing about that. I can almost promise you that you haven't heard the full story. So what really happened in Massachusetts in the 1600s, and what does it have to do with Thanksgiving? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shayla Fontaine, and this is History Fix Kids, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. Grown-ups, remember you can access lesson materials to go with this episode at the link in the description. Thanksgiving is right around the corner, so it's time to finally get this story straight. Believe it or not, Thanksgiving is probably one of our most misunderstood holidays. For one, the holiday is tied to a meal shared between English settlers and Indigenous Americans at the Plymouth Colony back in 1621. But it didn't actually become a holiday until 1863, almost 250 years later. So what's up with that? In the years leading up to 1863, a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale was hard at work trying to make Thanksgiving a thing. Sarah was a writer mostly. She wrote for and edited several popular magazines in the 1800s. You're actually familiar with her work. Sarah Josepha Hale wrote the words to Mary Had a Little Lamb. Sarah really wanted a nationwide Thanksgiving holiday. She thought it would help bring the country together and make everyone get along. That was more important than ever in the mid-1800s. America was on the brink of a terrible civil war when half the country would separate and fight the other half. Sarah believed a holiday like Thanksgiving would help keep the country together. She asked the government over and over again throughout the 1850s to make Thanksgiving a national holiday, but they never seemed interested. She needed something to get their attention, and finally, she found just the thing. In 1855, a journal was discovered hiding on a shelf in a library in London. This wasn't just any old journal, it was the journal of William Bradford, governor of the Plymouth Colony. So how did it end up in London across a whole ocean? Well, it was stolen by the British during the Revolutionary War around 60 years before. This was a big rediscovery, this journal. It was published into a book called Of Plymouth Plantation. And to many, it told the story of our nation's birth, including the story of the first Thanksgiving. To Sarah Josepha Hale, it was exactly what she needed. She went back to the government. Look, she said, see this meal that Governor Bradford wrote about? This was the first Thanksgiving. We need to carry on this tradition. It worked. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln officially made Thanksgiving a national holiday. For her efforts, Sarah Josepha Hale became known as the Mother of Thanksgiving. Sarah used that story. She needed that story of the first Thanksgiving to convince lawmakers that we should have a Thanksgiving holiday. But there's a whole lot more to the story that often gets left out. So let's talk about the real story of the Plymouth Colony and the meal we like to call the first Thanksgiving. In 1620, a group of 102 colonists traveled to North America from England on a ship called the Mayflower. Around 40 of these colonists were Puritans. Puritans were Christians who wanted to worship differently. They decided to leave England for religious freedom so that they could worship in their own way. They're also called pilgrims because they went on a pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is a journey or a trip for religious reasons. This group of colonists arrived near what is today Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It took a while to build the settlement, to build houses and shelters for them to live in. Most of the colonists lived on the ship that first winter while the building was happening. It was rough. It was very cold, and many of them suffered from diseases. We think that around half of the colonists died that first winter. By spring, the survivors finally moved off of the ship and into their houses at the settlement they called the Plymouth Colony. Plymouth was the name of the port town in England the Mayflower had left from many months before. That's why they named it that. They were probably missing England. When the colonists came ashore, they were greeted by an indigenous man who was the leader of the nearby Abenaki tribe. They were very surprised to find that this man spoke English. How was that even possible? It soon became clear. The Abenaki leader left and came back the next day with another indigenous man who also spoke English quite well. This man's name was Squanto. Well, really his name was Tisquantum, Squanto for short. Squanto told the colonists a crazy story. Do you guys want to hear it? Okay, here's what happened. Squanto was part of another group of indigenous people called the Patuxet who lived nearby. But around 6 years ago, in 1614, he had been kidnapped from his village by an English sea captain named Thomas Hunt. Hunt sold Squanto into slavery, and he was sent across the ocean to Spain. Once he got there, Squanto either escaped slavery or managed to win back his freedom. He made his way to England, where he worked as a shipbuilder and learned to speak English. A few years later, he got a job on a ship heading back to North America for trade. He was going to be their interpreter, so he would help them speak to the indigenous people when they got there. Once he reached North America again, Squanto made his way back to his Patuxet village. He was hoping to see his friends and family again. But sadly, when he arrived, he found that everyone in his village had died. They had been completely wiped out by diseases brought by European explorers. Squanto was the only survivor. What many people don't realize is that there used to be a lot of indigenous people living in the Americas, whole huge civilizations. By the time the Plymouth colonists arrived, it seemed like there weren't all that many. That's because an estimated 90 to 96% of indigenous Americans had been killed by diseases brought by the first European explorers. They didn't have any immunity to these foreign diseases. Their bodies had no way of fighting off the germs. So they died by the masses. We really don't see anything like it anywhere else in human history. 90 to 96%. It's horribly tragic. What it means is that the indigenous groups living in the area around the Plymouth colony, the Abenaki, the Patuxet, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, were in really rough shape when the English colonists arrived in 1620. One of those groups, the Wampanoag, had lost 75% of their people to disease. They looked at the English as a possible ally. Maybe the English would help protect them from their enemies, the Narragansett. The English had guns, after all, something indigenous people did not have. The Wampanoag leader Massasoit decided to make friends with the English, and he used Squanto with his English skills to communicate with them. Squanto taught the English how to plant crops, get sap from maple trees, and find plants to eat that weren't poisonous. He also tried to teach them how to bathe. The English didn't really take baths. They thought bathing was unhealthy and that being naked was immodest, so they just never took baths. Squanto tried to help them with that, probably because they smelled bad. But he also taught them how to plant crops, and they had some success. They had their first successful harvest in the fall of 1621. They decided to celebrate the harvest with a big meal, a feast. They didn't exactly invite the indigenous people to the meal, though. Here's what really happened. As part of the celebrations, they fired their guns into the air. Think like how we might set off fireworks on the 4th of July. It was that sort of thing. But the Wampanoag didn't know that. They heard the gunshots and they thought the English were about to attack them. Massasoit gathered his warriors and marched to the Plymouth Colony prepared for battle. When they got there, they were surprised to find the English celebrating and preparing to eat a big harvest feast. The Wampanoag joined them in preparing the food, and they all sat down and ate together. The first Thanksgiving feast wasn't exactly the same as what we eat on Thanksgiving today. There were wild turkeys living in the area, but they most likely didn't eat turkey. They probably ate foods that the indigenous people usually ate. This would have included venison, which is deer meat, shellfish, corn, which was typically ground into cornmeal and then boiled into a corn mush or porridge, plus fruits and vegetables like beans, squash, blueberries, grapes, that sort of thing. This is where the story of the first Thanksgiving usually ends. The English and the Wampanoag sit down together as friends to share a meal and give thanks for the harvest and everything good in their lives. This is the ending to the story Sarah Josepha Hale worked so hard to tie to our Thanksgiving holiday today. It's a happy ending, something worth celebrating. In reality, there's a lot more to the story. We don't usually talk about what happened next because it's really, really sad. But we can't just forget about the sad things that have happened. Sometimes the saddest stories are the most important to remember. They teach us important lessons that we shouldn't forget. So I'm going to tell you what happened next. Remember, Massasoit was the leader of the Wampanoag during the first Thanksgiving. Years later, when Massasoit died, his son took over as the new leader. His son's name was Metacomet, but he would eventually go by King Philip instead. Now, a lot had happened since his father, Massasoit, had befriended the English. Many more indigenous people had died from diseases. Many more English colonists, thousands more, had arrived from England. The English had started to take over. They were taking more and more indigenous land. They wanted the Wampanoag to stop following their old religion and become Christians instead. They wanted them to dress and live and act like the English. This all started to bother Metacomet, King Philip. He felt like all of their customs, their culture, their way of life was being erased. Things were getting out of hand. In 1675, it got really bad. Some Wampanoag men were killed by the English. Metacomet, King Philip, would not stand for it. He gathered his warriors and began attacking English settlements. It wasn't just the Plymouth Colony anymore by 1675. There were English settlements popping up all over by then. King Philip started to attack them. The English declared war against the Wampanoag and their allies. This war would come to be called King Philip's War. And it was really, really bad. Many people were killed on both sides. In fact, King Philip's War was the bloodiest conflict in American history in terms of population. And yet, we never, ever talk about it. It's hard to talk about sad things. The English won King Philip's War, and they were not kind to the survivors afterwards. Indigenous people who survived all the fighting were enslaved. Many were sent to work on plantations in the Caribbean. It's pretty wild to think that just 50 years after the English and the Wampanoag sat down for that meal together, the first Thanksgiving, things ended this badly. If you remember, Sarah Josepha Hale based her argument for a Thanksgiving holiday on the Journal of Governor William Bradford. Bradford had written about that first Thanksgiving meal with the Wampanoag in 1621. He didn't write about King Philip's War, though. Bradford's last entry in the journal was from 1650. King Philip's War didn't happen for another 25 years, so that part of the story got left out of the history of Thanksgiving. We chose to focus just on the happy parts, and that makes sense. It's a happy holiday after all. But now imagine for a moment that you're an Indigenous American sitting in your social studies classroom and learning about the history of Thanksgiving. You're learning about the English and Squanto and the Wampanoag. You're learning about that fateful meal, the venison and the corn mush. Then that's it. That's the end. Happy Thanksgiving. But you know it isn't the end. This story didn't have a happy ending at all, not for your people. What about the rest of the story? How would that make you feel? We have to be careful when we're learning about history that we learn the full story, even the sad parts. Sometimes the best lessons come from the sad parts. The story of the first Thanksgiving, the full story, is really very sad. But that doesn't mean we should stop celebrating. Thanksgiving is an important holiday. Giving thanks and appreciating the good is really important. You want to know what I'm thankful for this Thanksgiving? I'm thankful for knowledge. I'm thankful for the full story, even though it's sad. I'm thankful for the chance to learn from the past and to do better in the future. What are you thankful for this Thanksgiving? Thank you all so very much for joining me on History Fix Kids. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Grown-ups, remember you can access those lesson materials at the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about the show. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.